The international community is calling for calm as violent protests continue in Colombia. At least 19 people have been killed and many others injured, with most of the blame directed at the Colombian president and accusations of excessive force by authorities. RT's Alex Mihailovich has the story.
7 days of mass protests and violence. Thousands of people in Colombia initially took to the streets last week to demonstrate against a coronavirus-related tax reform proposed by the government.
This tax increase will impoverish the middle class of this country and enrich the wealthiest in this country, Colombia.
But, according to the Colombian government, the tax, which was introduced on April the 15th, is meant to boost Latin America's fourth largest economy, which shrank by 6.8% in 2020 due to strict COVID-19 restrictions. Unemployment in Colombia reached 16.8% this past March, while over 42% of the population of 50 million now lives in poverty. With thousands of Colombians across the country rallying against the tax, this past Sunday, Colombian President Iván Duque took a step back.
I'm asking Congress to withdraw the law proposed by the Ministry of Finance and urgently process a new law that is the fruit of consensus in order to avoid financial uncertainty.
But even after Duque withdrew the tax hike, it wasn't enough to stop the protesters who are calling for improvements to the country's pension, health, and education systems. And they're also demanding an end to excessive police force.
We really don't know what will happen. We don't know what other proposals they'll have. We don't know what other name this situation will be given. We are concerned about health reform. There have been so many other things that we are concerned about that haven't been taken into account in this change. So it's not something that we are happy about yet.
While many of the protests have been relatively peaceful, there have been numerous cases of violence, particularly in Cali, the country's third largest city. According to reports, throughout Colombia, at least 19 people have died, including one police officer. Police have been accused of firing weapons at civilians. Over the course of the protests, authorities have detained 431 people, and the government deployed the military in the worst affected cities. On Monday, Colombia's defense minister blamed illegal armed groups for looting and vandalism during the protests. With rallies continuing, there have been calls from the United Nations and others in the international community, including the U.S., urging Colombia's government to protect the rights of protesters. Here's Josep Borrell, the European Union foreign policy chief at the G7 foreign ministers meeting in London.
We have to condemn these 19 people being killed in a demonstration. It's something that is really worries us, and we call for a moderate and adequate use of force.
Earlier this week, Colombia's finance minister resigned. The government is asking for a national dialogue in hopes of restoring calm. For RT, I'm Alex Mihailovich.
And earlier today, I was joined by James Patrick Jordan, the national coordinator for the Alliance for Global Justice, for his take on all of this. Here's what he had to say. Human rights organizations on the ground are saying the situation is even more dire than is being reported. What are you hearing?
That is what I'm hearing. It's much more dire. The latest statistics I have speak of 26 people who have been killed, but that information is over a day old. I've heard of reports of at least 9 women who have been sexually violated by members of the armed force, and especially the hated riot police ESMAD, a pattern of shooting protesters in the eyes. I hear reports from different people in Colombia, and again, I can't verify this, but I'm hearing it from multiple people that say they have talked to family members who are in the military and are hearing that they have been given orders to shoot to kill. It's just brutal. I also understand that and again, these are reports I'm hearing in real time from my contacts on the ground, but I hear that there's been disruption of social media, and I don't know if that's true or not, but I know that I'm getting less reports right now than I was yesterday, even though these strikes are continuing.
Yeah, these anecdotal stories are very important for us, at least here stateside, to understand what's happening on the ground. And you know what, Colombia, is kind of the U.S.'s dirty little secret in Latin America. I mean, many would argue that their human rights situation is way worse in that region, yet they are never the target of regime change efforts. It's just the opposite, in fact. They receive a great deal of support from the United States. What's the situation like for activists and dissidents on the ground in Colombia, and why does the U.S. provide so much support to the Colombian government?
Well, I just want to say that you can't talk about Colombia without talking about Venezuela, first of all, and you're hitting on something very important here. The United States has a blockade against Venezuela. It is using Colombia as a base of operations for interference in Venezuela. And every time anyone has a hard time getting something to eat because of the blockade in Venezuela, we hear about hunger. Every time there's any kind of protest, we hear about disruption and human rights violations. And so many times what we're hearing are lies and distortions, but we never hear about what's going on in Colombia. We don't hear about the thousands of children, indigenous children that have died of hunger in La Guajira because of transnational corporate practices. We don't hear about how every day more than one person is being killed every day in Colombia who is a social movement leader or participant in the peace process. We don't hear about those. And you ask why? Why? Because Colombia is a linchpin and a loyal servant in the designs of the U.S. and NATO empire in Latin America and around the world. Colombia has a close connection with the U.S. military. Colombia has I don't know the latest statistics, but Colombia has trained something like 50,000 military personnel, police personnel, prison personnel in other countries, especially in Central America and Mexico, but elsewhere. They are partners with NATO. They have patrolled Central American and West African sea spaces and sky spaces with the U.S. military. They've sent troops to Afghanistan, to Yemen. So they are, the reason we don't hear about them is because they are such important partners in the empire and its quest to dominate the world for the privatization of resources. That's simply what it is.
Well, some U.S. lawmakers are uncharacteristically denouncing the Colombian government for their actions here. Why is that happening right now? And what can come of these denouncements?
Well, fortunately, there is a good, strong core of U.S. lawmakers who have taken principled stands on Colombia, including Jim McGovern has been a leader. My congressperson, Raul Grijalva, have had a good record on that. And these denouncements are very important. I think others are having to denounce because it's just so shocking. But the reality is that there has been bipartisan support for increasing military and security aid to Colombia, even in the midst of this crisis, in the midst of brutal repression by the ESMAD riot police, who were co-created by the United States government and who were armed by the United States government, even when they were committing massacres against protesters in Bogota, even as the humanitarian crisis and the murder of social movement leaders has increased, the U.S. Congress passed a military and security aid package to Colombia that was the highest in 9 years. So clearly both sides of the aisle are culpable in what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to leave it right there. James Patrick Jordan of the Alliance for Global Justice, thank you so much for joining us today.